And we hope that by the time they appoint new ministers, that we'll have people who have more sense of urgency in driving the economic transformation of this country. We're already seeing comments that are giving some of our concerns, particularly coming from members of the political party that's in governance. Take, for instance, the chairman of the Federal Energy Service, just about a fortnight ago, came out to say that he recommended that government should increase value-added tax. Yesterday, only yesterday, the leader of the party was of opposing opinion that the government should inflict more pains on the citizens should increase VAT. So we should expect to hear some level of harmonization of opinion coming from members of the higher level of the current government. We're not hearing that. We should also see, like I mentioned, a more sense of urgency as it relates to policy formulation. Part of the reasons why we saw what we did in the past was we saw a government that was bent on passing buck to previous government. Well, yesterday we were disappointed that we were hearing that again from the vice president, blaming every woe of the country on past government. The duty of the government is to build the future. You cannot reverse the past. Yes, the past will give us a sense of history of what went wrong. But we shouldn't dwell on the past forever. I mean, after 4 years being in power, I expect the government come out smoking, like what they say, come out smoking after winning the election, to come up with clear and implementable policy decisions.
So your view is that it's not acceptable for you to take a break and say, it's not my fault, give me a break. No, you have to deal with the situation at hand.
Absolutely, because we're not going to call back those who governed us in the past to come and reverse the mistakes or whatever injury they did to this country. We have given you the mandate to transform the country. We are not going to be beholden or held back by the fact that we had failed in the past. We as a people have to move forward. There are people who are 2 years, 3 years, 4 years old. They didn't know what happened 50 years ago, 30 years ago. You are not going to fail to change their future because somebody in the past did this, a couple of things wrong. Reality is that once you have been given the mandate of leadership, you have to move the people forward. I think the government must learn to stop this idea of buck passing. We've had enough of that. We need a change in this policy environment. We need a government that will drive the transformation of the country. In terms of brain power, I believe the government has it. But the key thing is that, do they have the compelling urge to recognize that, look, passing the buck does not change anything.
So passing the buck doesn't change anything. Right now, everyone's talking about reform. We hear it all the time. But is there any sign that there is actually focus? Can the government actually show that it's focused on something to fulfill this promise of reform?
Yes, I mean, what the government should do, if I were to advise them, is to pick up a few sectors and make those sectors as its linchpin for transforming the country. The issue of infrastructure, the government has come up with a number of infrastructural initiatives. We need to see see them drive successfully. I mean, in your intro, you mentioned the second Niger bridge. Under the current arrangement to fund the second Niger bridge from budgetary allocation, I do not imagine the bridge will complete in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So the government needs to review, does it have the financial resources to fund some of this critical infrastructure that it has earmarked in its development plan, particularly the economic recovery and growth plan? If it doesn't, the next thing is step back and say, how do we fund these projects using alternative funding source, options? Let me give you a classical example. Last year, in 2018, the government projected an income revenue of, at the federal level, revenue of 7.16 trillion naira. The government was only able to achieve 3.9 trillion naira. The implication is that there was no way the government could actually do capital expenditure without borrowing.
So how can they make these projections? It has to be based in some sort of reality. Are they just fudging these numbers, knowing that they'll miss the targets?
Well, the key thing is it starts from the basis of the assumptions on which the budget is premised on. Take, for instance, you're looking at a budget benchmark of about $60 per barrel in the current year. Last year was about $54 per barrel. Yes, we achieved that budget benchmark last year with the budget oil traded average about $71 per barrel. But production volume was projected at 2.3 million barrels per day, whereas actual production was in the region of 1.6 million barrels per day over the last 1 year.
That was not foreseeable?
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly foreseeable. Even the current year that they are still projecting about 2.3 million barrels, we feel that is very optimistic. Because even if we factor in the Guinea, which is supposed to come in with about 200,000 barrels per day crude production as we speak, you will still find it difficult to achieve a 2 million barrels per day, even kicking in condensate, because you have to deal with, at some point, breach of pipelines. Until you have an absolute control over the level of insecurity in that data, you can't be 100% sure that all the wells will be producing at full capacity. And then you have to deal with the issue of natural occurrences. So the reality is that projections, revenue projections of the government seem to be too optimistic. And once you get the revenue projections wrong, every other assumption of the budget collapses, because you are going to generate the revenue to actually incur the cost. And let me highlight to you, unfortunately for the government, when they are unable to achieve their revenue projections, it becomes almost impossible to go into full capital expenditure implementation. Simple reason, capital expenditure is discretionary. What I mean by discretionary in the sense that, look, it's only when you have extra resource that you can go into capital expenditure. There are expenditure of the government that are compulsory. Like recurrent expenditure, they must pay salaries, they must run the overhead of the government. So if the recurrent expenditure last year consumed 3.2 trillion of the 3.9 trillion that the government generated, and debt service, which is also non-discretionary, consumed about 2.2 trillion naira, then the government was only left with one option: to borrow to fund any kobo in infrastructure. And that is why, as it stands today, we cannot really build the infrastructure the government has projected to do from budgetary allocation, because the government does not have that revenue to fund not even its own recurrent expenditure, which is projected this year 4 trillion, and debt service, which is projected about 2.2 trillion, which is already 6.2 trillion. If you look at the fact that the government is projecting to generate revenue of 6.9 trillion, which is almost impossible this year, then there's no way the government can fund capital expenditure.
It seems like we should be electing the people who actually make these projections, because someone is getting it wrong. And on that note about the team, what needs to change with the particular team now that's in office? Anything?
Well, everything has to change with the
Everything
team.
has to change.
Everything has to change. There's what we call zero-based budgeting. You start from assumption of ground zero. So you look at who is most. A lot of people in the government, current government, are competent. But whether they have been assigned to portfolios where they have their core competence is what you have to review. Whether you have actually consolidated too many critical job functions into one individual, we have to review those things. The key thing that the government should ask itself: what are those sectors that are most critical, that are quick wins, that the government must make a clear statement?
A quick win.
Yes.
Okay.
And then you look at how do we populate them in terms of staffing, who should run each of these ministries. You look for your best people, the first 11, and put them in those critical ministries. And if you achieve results in 3-4 key areas of the economy or the society, you are going to leave a lasting landmark of your government by the time you leave.
So the CBN signaled a pro-growth monetary stance. Should we be optimistic about this particular pro-growth era? Is it imminent, or is that, as you've hinted before, just talk, not backed by any numbers?
For me, what I would say that the decision of the central bank to reduce the monetary policy rates is what you may call a policy directional shift. You know, we've dealt from July 2016, when they moved the monetary policy rate to 14%, we've dealt with a contractionary monetary policy environment. What the central bank has done is to signpost a shift in its policy orientation from contractionary monetary policy to accommodative monetary policy, to say, look, we're going to allow liquidity to flow into the economy, even if it has to come at the expense of increase in inflation rate. Previously, the central bank was focused on maintaining price stability, managing exchange rate, managing inflation rate. Right now, the central bank has posted a shift in that policy to say we will now focus on driving economic growth. And what do I mean by that? You know, if you had listened to the central bank governor's announcement of the decisions of the Monetary Policy Committee, he did mention one critical factor, and that is that the monetary authorities expect inflation to trend upwards from March to May. So ideally, if you expect inflation to trend upwards, what you should do is to apply the brakes by increasing the benchmark rate.
And yet they didn't do that.
But they didn't do that. They reversed that. They did a reverse of that, which says clearly that we are ready to drive economic growth, even if it has to come at the expense of higher inflation. So it's a message they send to the investing public.
Well, they sent that message. However, the banks aren't lending as much. I mean, that's the other issue. They're not passing that savings on to the actual consumers. Hopefully, it'll draw in some foreign investment. So getting money into this country is apparently really, really, really critical, but it's not happening as much.
On the aspect of the banks, a lot of factors have to come into consideration before the banks will actually open their vaults. One of which is that they have to deal with a high level of non-performing loans. The economy is still growing at a very sluggish rate, which is why the key element of the transformation of the economy or the change in the current economic growth rate has to come from the fiscal side, the executive arm's decisions. There's a limit to what the monetary authorities can do, given the structural deficiencies of the economy, because the transmission channel for effectiveness of monetary policy is very weak in the country. You do not have consumer credit. So you don't have a situation where monetary policy rate is reduced, lending rate goes down, then consumers begin to borrow and increase aggregate consumption and aggregate demand, which will lead to a higher level of production. We don't have that transmission channel. So we must recognize that. And since we don't have that transmission channel, we must find alternative channels to use in driving liquidity into the economy. Today, the banks are finding it difficult to lend when they have high level of non-performing, about 18% of their loan book is non-performing. Two, the economy is growing at a very anemic rate at 1.92%, which is worsening the level of non-performing loan, because your economy has to grow at a fast rate for business to do well and pay off their loans. So you have to deal with that. And then the structural deficiency in terms of the cost of lending is still high, the banks have to factor in their cost of operation and add it to the weighted average cost of funds to arrive at what they call all-in weighted average cost of funds to determine the rate which they will lend. You still have to deal with high operating costs. Those factors the banks have to take into consideration. The third factor, which we must not lose sight of, is that the government is still borrowing heavily. I did mention the issue of shortfall in government revenue, which is being made up by borrowing. If the government continues to borrow at the rate they are borrowing, they will continue to crowd out the private sector. Last report from the central bank governor in announcing the monetary policy rate, he said that the credit to the economy grew by 10.6%, of which credit to the private sector only grew by about 6.8%. Credit to the government grew by 17%, which is government is the one doing the borrowing, because they can borrow at a
preferential rate.
Yeah, preferential rate, and also government is of lower credit risk than private sector. So if government continues to borrow, there will be little resources available to the private sector. Not only that, the banks will be rational in their lending, which is give the money to the one who can pay you if he even has to pay you via a lower rate than the person who has a risk that he will not pay you. So the government must slow down at the rate at which it's borrowing, which takes us back to the issue I mentioned earlier. The government must find alternative funding sources to fund capital expenditure or to build capital expenditure. It cannot continue from budgetary allocations.